What happens when your older brother is too overprotective? My older brother Marcus started getting weird about my social life right after he got his new job at the phone company 3 months ago. Before that, he was pretty normal. We got along fine, he minded his own business, typical sibling relationship. But suddenly, he was asking questions about every guy I talked to, wanting to know where I was going on dates, insisting on driving me places instead of letting me take the bus. At first, I thought it was sweet, maybe just big brother instincts kicking in since I'd turned 18. The strange part was how much he seemed to know about my plans without me telling him. I'd mentioned going to dinner with Jake from my college class, and Marcus would say something like, "Hope you don't mind the noise from the construction next to that restaurant on 5th Street, but I'd never told him which restaurant we were going to. When I asked how he knew, he'd just shrug and say he'd driven past it earlier. But 5th Street was nowhere near his work route or anywhere he normally went. Small details like that kept happening. I'd tell him I was meeting my friend Ashley for coffee, and he'd warn me about the broken sidewalk outside the coffee shop before I'd even mentioned which one. He started offering to drive me everywhere, which was unusual because he used to complain constantly about being my personal taxi service. Now he seemed eager to give me rides, always insisting it was no trouble. During these car rides, he'd make comments about people on the street that seemed oddly specific, like pointing out a blue Honda and saying the owner had 3 unpaid parking tickets, or mentioning that the guy walking his dog had recently moved here from Denver. Random information that no one would normally know or care about. When I asked how he knew these things, he'd change the subject quickly. The breaking point came last week when I was getting ready for a date with a guy named Ryan I'd met through a dating app. Marcus knocked on my bedroom door and said we needed to talk. He sat on my bed looking more serious than I'd ever seen him. "I need you to cancel tonight," he said quietly. "Trust me on this one, okay? Just tell Ryan something came up." When I asked why, he hesitated for a long moment. Then he said, "Some people aren't who they pretend to be online." That's when I realized Marcus somehow knew Ryan's name, even though I'd never mentioned it to him. I'd been careful about keeping my dating life private because of how nosy he'd become. "How do you know his name?" I asked, my stomach starting to twist. Marcus looked uncomfortable, like he'd said something he shouldn't have. "Lucky guess," he mumbled. "Most dating app guys have basic names like Ryan or Tyler," but his explanation felt forced and didn't make sense. I pressed him harder, asking exactly what he meant about people not being who they pretend to be. He kept deflecting, saying he just had a bad feeling, and asking me to trust him. Finally, he left my room, but I heard him making a phone call in the hallway. I couldn't make out most of what he was saying, but I caught fragments like, "Yeah, she's supposed to meet him tonight, and I think you're right about this one." That night, I pretended to cancel my date, but actually snuck out through my bedroom window to meet Ryan anyway. I was determined to prove Marcus was being paranoid for no reason. But when I got to the restaurant, I saw Marcus sitting in his car across the street, watching the entrance. He'd been following me and somehow tracking my movements for months. I confronted him the next morning, demanding to know why he'd been spying on me. That's when he finally told me what he'd discovered through his job at the phone company, and why he'd been so desperate to protect me.